This is Dom Bettinelli, the CEO of SQPN, with a brief but very important message. For more than a decade, SQPN has produced the Catholic faith and pop culture podcasts that you love. We're a nonprofit organization, so it's only your generosity that lets us carry out our mission. We haven't run a fundraiser in 2 years, and that's why we need to ask for your help right now. Please make a pledge of whatever amount you can afford to help us continue providing your favorite podcasts, as well as exciting new ones we have planned. To make your pledge and find out about the free thank you gifts we'd like to send you, visit sqpn.com/give. That's sqpn.com/give. Thank you for your generosity. May we hear from you today? You're listening to episode 13 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where we look at mysteries, both natural and supernatural, from the perspectives of both faith and reason. And in this episode, we're talking about the mystery of cloning. I'm Dom Bettinelli, and joining me today is Jimmy Akin. Hi, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
Before we get started, I want to remind folks to remember to like the podcast, Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, on Facebook. We have a Facebook page. To retweet our episodes on Twitter, leave us comments on our show notes on Facebook and Twitter and wherever you find the show. Subscribe to the podcast. You can do that in iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, your favorite podcast app, or even YouTube. We upload these as videos on YouTube. It's an audio-only video. And when you subscribe, make sure you hit the bell on YouTube to get notifications. And please, especially share the podcast with your friends. Please, if you're enjoying this, help us grow our community of listeners. And the more listeners we get, the more feedback we get, and the more it adds to the quality of the show. And we really do appreciate that. And also want to add, please stick around to the end of this show because we're going to have mysterious feedback, like I said, and mysterious headlines, as always.
Yeah.
So, Jimmy, you have something you want to say to the folks as well before we begin.
Right, yeah. So right now, StarQuest, the podcasting network that produces Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, is having a giving campaign. We're a nonprofit organization, and we're devoted to exploring geek culture from a Catholic perspective as a way of bringing people closer to Jesus. That's part of our name, StarQuest. It's a reference to the Star of Bethlehem and how it guided the wise men to the baby Jesus. So we have a spiritual mission, and we need your help to support that mission. We haven't run a giving campaign in a couple of years, and as a result, our funds are now getting to the depleted point. We made a decision, the board of SQPN did, earlier this year to hire a full-time producer so that we could produce a range of podcasts, not just limp along producing one. That's one of the reasons that you have Mysterious World coming to you, because I don't have time to do all the production work and the file uploading and everything. Dom is doing all of that, and he's also overseeing all of our different podcasting efforts. And we have, in addition to needing to be able to pay him, we've got the hosting costs. We have computer software and equipment, sound equipment we need to pay for and things like that. And so we really do need your support. If we don't get your support, then we will have to scale back and limp along and not fulfill our mission. So we really do need to hear from you right now. We're getting up to the Christmas season, and lots of people show their support for different nonprofits at this time of year. We really hope you will show your support for us. The way to do that is by going to sqpn.com. That's sqpn.com for StarQuest Podcast Network.com. And it's sqpn.com/give. And you can become one of our regular Patreon supporters. We have some thank you gifts we'd like to send you. They're themed around your favorite StarQuest shows, whether it might be Doctor Who or Star Trek or even Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. I picked out some course materials, some books, and audio that I think you would find really fascinating that links into the topics we discuss here on Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. So by all means, go to sqpn.com/give, click on the Patreon button, and you'll find out all about those mysterious thank yous that we'd like to send you. Also, remember, your donations are tax deductible. So as you're preparing you're giving for the remainder of the year to ensure a good tax refund for you next year, please do remember us in your giving. We do need it at this time.
Thank you, Jimmy. Thank you for that message, and thank you, listeners. So let's get into the topic for today, which is the mystery of cloning. Now, when we talk about cloning, what are we actually talking about?
On this podcast, we're going to be talking about cloning an entire new organism that's genetically identical to a previously existing one. Sometimes when scientists talk about cloning, they're not talking about a whole organism. They'll be talking about like cloning a kidney or cloning a liver, or just something that's a single organ, but not a whole organism. And that's not the kind of cloning that we're interested in here. That's an interesting subject. We may talk about that in the future. But today we're going to be talking about coming up with a whole new organism based on a previous one.
And so this is a staple of science fiction. You know, you see this in all kinds of stories. There've been lots of movies. I think there's been at least 2 Arnold Schwarzenegger movies that have included cloning, for instance, and all kinds of fantastical ideas are out there about what cloning is and that sort of thing. So, but what is cloning as we know it today? There are a couple different kinds, right?
Yeah. So the 2 kinds you'll hear about most often are called therapeutic cloning and reproductive cloning. And in therapeutic cloning, the idea is you produce a clone and you do something with it that with an idea towards providing a therapy of some kind. This could be producing a batch of clones and then studying them to learn more about, say, embryology and how embryos of a given species develop, but then you don't let them come to term. You kill them off before you let them be born. Or you might create a batch of clones and then process them so that they become some kind of therapy that you could apply to someone. So not only are you studying them, but you're also using them to produce a treatment of some kind, like stem cell treatments or something like that. Stem cell lines are often based on a kind of therapeutic cloning, not necessarily of entire organisms, but they are in this batch. What we're more interested in, or what we're going to spend more of our time talking about, though, is not therapeutic cloning, but what's called reproductive cloning. Reproductive cloning is where you do bring the clones to term so that they are born and they grow up. And so ideally, if you're a millionaire who has no moral problems with cloning, you could like have a mini-me, a little clone of yourself that you then bring to term and let live on to replace you once you die.
And there is lots of stuff in sci-fi where they clone adults, where like the clone is a perfect adult human copy.
Yeah, and that's more sci-fi. I mean, maybe there would be a way to do that one day, but we're nowhere close to that now. Right, the way it works right now is if you were to clone a human being, and there have not been reproductive human clones made yet. But if you were to have a clone baby of yourself, it would grow at a normal rate. It would have different experiences than you growing up. It would have different memories than you growing up. So you wouldn't, at the end of the process, just have an identical adult duplicate of you. You would have a genetic duplicate of you that grew up at a later time and in different circumstances, and that would take 20 years or whatever to mature.
Okay. So I don't want to get too much into that. I want to kind of ease into the various implications of that. But first, let's start with the claims. The claims. So almost the pro-cloning claims. I think they are.
Yeah. So among people who support cloning, they'll say this is a good thing because it'll give us new medical treatments, even personalized medical treatments, so that, if let's say you have a specific problem that is based on your genes or your immune system, like let's say you need a new liver or a new kidney, well, we could clone one for you that will match your genetic code, have your same immune system markers, and so you won't have problems with tissue rejection that you otherwise might have. Also, people will say we can learn a lot about how organisms develop if we make clones. We can test drugs on them to see how the drugs operate, what effects they have. Hypothetically, if you're doing the transplant route and creating organs for transplant, hypothetically, you could clone somebody a whole new body and just transplant your brain into it, and you would have a brand new body to live out a whole another multi-decade lifespan in.
That's hypothetical still.
Hypothetically.
Right.
Another thing that's been claimed is this would be a way for people to replace a dead child or pet that they really cared about. If you had a child and your child died, well, you could clone your child and it would kind of be like having that same child back. Or if you had a dog or a cat, you really loved the dog or cat, you could clone the dog or cat and have it be kind of like having that one back. It would presumably have many of the same temperaments and behave the same way and the different qualities that you loved about the first one. There have also been claims that this has actually been done in humans. Now, these claims have been very controversial. Some scientists in some part of the world have said that, we either have or are about to make human clones. And so far, those claims have tended to fall apart upon scrutiny. There were some unethical scientists making premature claims. But if you look at the Wikipedia page discussing this, it has a note where it says in January 2008, Dr. Andrew French and Samuel Wood of the biotechnology company Stemogen announced that they had successfully created the first 5 mature human embryos using SCNT, that's somatic cell nuclear transfer. We'll talk about that. In this case, each embryo was created by taking a nucleus from a skin cell donated by Wood and a colleague and inserted into a human egg from which the nucleus had been removed. That's what somatic cell nuclear transfer is. You take the nucleus, which has the genetic material, out of one cell and stick it in another cell like an ovum that's had its nucleus taken out, and then you cause it to divide. It says the embryos were developed only to the blastocyst stage. That's a very early stage where they're composed of a number of cells, but they are still very small, at which point they were studied in processes that destroyed them. So according to this claim, for 10 years, we've had human embryos that have been cloned using this method, but they haven't yet been brought to term.
As far as we know.
Yeah.
Okay. So these are the claims about cloning that
kind of pro-cloning claims.
Pro-cloning claims, so that we could have beneficial medical treatments. We could replace dead loved ones or pets or children, and that it's already begun. Now, what are the counter claims, like the anti-cloning claims?
Well, so an obvious one would be that some or all of the uses that we've just mentioned are immoral, that they're unethical for various reasons, and we shouldn't be pursuing them. Also, and this is more a claim of a more religious nature that some people have made, is that clones wouldn't have souls. So if you cloned a human child, let's say, the child would have no soul.
That's been a feature a lot of the science fiction, where the reaction of religious people toward the clones is that they have no soul and therefore are abominations that must be destroyed. We could talk about
something like that.
We could talk about what we think religious people, like, say, the church, how it would react to actual cloned humans. We could talk about that when we get to the faith perspective.
Yeah, we're getting there.
Yes, good. All right, so those are pretty compact counterclaims, and so what do we know about cloning so we can make our way toward the perspectives?
Well, people tend to think of cloning as if it's a really new thing, and certain techniques like the somatic cell nuclear transfer that we mentioned, that is a new technique. That's only recently become possible. But actually, we've been artificially cloning organisms for millennia. This cloning itself is not a new thing. The term clone was produced by this scientist J.B.S. Haldane a little more than a century ago. He took it from the Greek word klon, which means twig. And the reason he took it from that word is because we've actually been cloning things that grow on twigs, like grapes, for millennia. That's one of the reasons you have seedless grapes, because without seeds, they can't reproduce on their own. The way we reproduce them is you take a twig from a grapevine and you either graft it onto another grapevine or plant it and get it to grow roots. But basically, you're twigging off new grapes from the new grapevines from the original grapevine. And in the process, you're cloning them.
It's also why we have wine in the world today, because there was a disaster in the wine grape growing farming decades ago that wiped out major portions of vineyards around the world, in various places in the world, and that they recovered by grafting and cloning the grape varietals onto hardier stock that survived, that imparted the ability to survive. So cloning is fundamental to human agriculture, certainly. Yeah,
and it's, as I said, it's been around for millennia. Even St. Paul, if you read the book of Romans and you look in Romans chapter 9 through 11, especially in chapter 11, he has this image where he's talking about Jews and Gentiles, but he uses an analogy to agricultural grafting from one plant onto another, and in the process that would produce cloning as part of that. So this is something that we've had from all the way back to Jesus' day and before. And it's not just grapes, other plants too. We've used cloning with, like potatoes, bananas, things like that.
Okay.
In addition to humans artificially cloning organisms, many species naturally clone themselves. An obvious example of that are many kinds of bacteria that reproduce asexually. You'll have a single bacterium. It'll divide in two through a process called mitosis. Each of the two resulting bacteria takes half of the genetic material of the original, and it twins itself. So each one is genetically identical to the original. In addition, there are some plants that naturally clone themselves, including some kinds of blueberry plants. Also, some fungi will do this. And even some animals have a kind of cloning called parthenogenesis. This occurs in species where either the males have all died out or where males are very uncommon. And in these cases, females can become pregnant using their own genetic matter, just so it's one female, it's not involving another female, and the result will be a clone. And this happens in some kinds of insects, crustaceans, worms, hammerhead sharks, Komodo dragons, and some lizards. So this is something that exists in the natural world. It's part of nature, and it even naturally occurs in humans. Parthenogenesis doesn't naturally occur in humans, but cloning does in the case of identical twins, because you start with one zygote that is not genetically identical to either of its parents. So it has half of the genes of the father, half of the genes of the mother. But then at some point early in pregnancy, when an identical twinning occurs, that original developing embryo will split into two copies, which are genetically identical and therefore which are clones. There are some interesting questions that are wrapped up there, but basically we've had human clones for all of human history. We call them identical twins.
It's an interesting idea that the implication is that if we were to do artificial human cloning, the clone is therefore the original, quote unquote, the twin of that original, just displaced in time, essentially. It's an interesting way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
So,
and in fact, that because we don't have all the questions answered, as far as I'm aware, about exactly how identical twinning occurs, that may be what happens in some cases with identical twins. It may not be that the original embryo splits exactly in two. It may be that a little piece of it buds off to become the second twin. And in that case, you might have a claim to saying, okay, this one twin is the original and this other budded off from it.
All the twins listening to this episode now will start to say to their brother or sister, I'm the original, you're just the copy.
Yeah.
So what are the methods of artificial cloning that are available to scientists?
Well, there's basically two. One of them is artificial twinning. And this is basically, it's like taking a twig off of a grapevine, or in the case of an animal, taking an embryo and at a very early stage where this is still possible, pulling it apart, or at least pulling part of it off so that the other part can continue to develop and grow normally. So it's basically the same thing. It's just in the case of an animal, you can't do it with a mature organism. You have to do it at a very early stage. Because if you take like a mature human and pull them apart, you're not going to get two humans as a result.
We're not worms, or
yeah, we're not. And drawing and quartering does not produce clones. If it did, it wouldn't have been used as a punishment for so long.
Right.
The other method is the one we already mentioned, somatic cell nuclear transfer. Somatic just means bodily. So you take a cell from a person's body, maybe a skin cell, you take out the nucleus, which has the DNA, and then you transfer that into a new cell that's had its nucleus taken out, and then you, perhaps an ovum, and then you cause that to begin to divide and develop normally. So those are the two methods.
And so we've talked about like how cloning, we've been doing, as human beings, we've been doing it for millennia. But the ability to clone an animal, a higher level of beings, shall we say, to birth, that is something that has occurred in your mind in your lifetime.
Right. The most famous example of this was Dolly the sheep. Dolly was produced, I forget the exact year, but it's been within the last couple of decades.
Yeah.
And Dolly illustrated the difficulty of doing this with a higher organism like a mammal. It took apparently 434 attempts to clone a sheep before they finally got it right. So they had to try and try and try. They had a lot of failures on their way to success. Subsequent to Dolly being cloned, we've cloned a lot of other animals, some of which have made headlines, like Snuppy the clone puppy. But others have just been the subject of research and haven't really made it into the popular press.
Okay. So that's sort of an encapsulation of what we know about cloning. From a perspective of reason, what do we say about cloning? From a logic and reason perspective.
Actually, let's hit the faith perspective first.
Okay.
In creating, so we have to make some differentiations here, and they kind of go back. One of them goes back to what we talked about at the beginning of the episode. If you're cloning a whole new organism, that's a different thing than cloning a part of an organism. The church has real problems with the idea of cloning a human being in its entirety, for reasons we'll talk about. But the church would not necessarily have a problem with, say, let's take some stem cells, maybe from your blood, and clone you a new kidney or liver. Right. That, because you're not creating a human being there, that could be conceived of potentially as a legitimate medical therapy. Because kidneys and livers, since they're not humans, they don't have human rights. And consequently, it's okay to treat a kidney or a liver like a kidney or a liver. If you're creating a human being, though, you have to treat them like a human being. And that relates to the other distinction. It's really humans that are the moral issue. Cloning is, from a faith perspective, is not a problem when it comes to animals or plants. Animals and plants are not the subject of rights the way humans are. We may, because of our human nature, we need to be kind and treat them in a humane way, even if we eat them or something like that. We still need to be humane. But that's because of our nature is to be humane, not because they have rights. And in fact, the fact we've been cloning plants for millennia is an illustration of the fact we don't have a problem with cloning non-humans. It's when we get to humans that the issue becomes engaged.
Okay. And just kind of some distinctions or some scenarios. What if we cloned a body without allowing consciousness? Say, if you cloned and prevented the brain from developing, is that still a problem?
This one is, I mean, if you cloned individual pieces and then put them together so that you had a kind of Frankenstein body, but they were never originally one body, then that would seem to be more morally acceptable than if you create an entire human body and just damage the brain so that it doesn't develop properly. That looks like you're creating a person. You're not just putting together organs. In that case, it looks like you're creating a human being and deliberately inflicting damage on the human being.
Right.
And you couldn't do that with a clone human any more than you could do it with an ordinary baby human.
Okay. So, and let's kind of dig down. Why from a faith perspective, from a Christian perspective, and I think even do you know if cloning would be a problem for other faiths other than Christianity, for Judaism or Islam, or do you happen to know?
It's going to depend. There will be people from each faith perspective who are likely to disfavor cloning, and others who might be open to it. The only religion I know that has a pro-cloning stance is the Raelians. The Raelians are kind of a science fiction-y based religion that's very recent, and they actually want human cloning as a way of providing immortality.
Okay. And I kind of hinted at the top that or talked about that. We talked about movies that depict Christians who they think that clones have no soul, therefore they're an abomination, must be destroyed. How would, say, the church react toward a cloned person?
The church would say this person is a person and they have a soul. There's not going to be any debate about that among Catholic theologians for a couple of reasons. One is that traditionally Catholic theology has recognized that that every living creature has a soul. Even plants, classically, like back St. Thomas Aquinas would say, plants have what are called vegetative souls that allow them to live and grow and reproduce. Animals have what are called sensitive souls that allow them not only to grow and reproduce, but also to feel and engage in a primitive kind of reasoning. And then humans have what are called rational souls, where in addition to being able to grow and reproduce and feel, we also have a robust gift of reasoning. So classically, Christian theology has said every living thing has a soul. The soul is, in fact, the life principle of the body. As James says in his epistle in the New Testament, in James chapter 2, the body without the spirit is dead. So if you've got a living body, then you've got a soul. It's just a question of what kind, and does your soul survive death?
And as we said earlier, cloning is essentially a twin of the original. Right. And if a twin has a soul and independent of the other person is an independent person.
That was my second point. Although I want to point out first, though, that in the case of human souls, we know human souls survive death because that's revealed to us. The historical view has been that animal and plant souls don't survive death, but that seems to be a theological opinion rather than an actual teaching of the church. So there's some room for discussion on that. But as you say, because twins are clones, they have souls, and the church has always acknowledged that twins have souls. In fact, Jesus seems to have acknowledged that twins have souls because one of his disciples was Thomas. Thomas, also known by the Greek name Didymus, was a twin. apparently. That's what Thomas means in Aramaic and what Didymus means in Greek. So it probably wasn't his birth name. He probably had a different birth name. But because he was a twin, people called him, oh, yeah, that's so-and-so the twin. And twin became his nickname. And since Jesus made a twin one of his apostles, now I have to say we don't know he was an identical twin, but let's suppose he was. Jesus made him one of the apostles and obviously was concerned for the salvation of his soul.
Okay, right. That's actually a very good, I never thought of it before, but that's a very interesting way of approaching that.
Yeah.
And so when it comes down to it, human clones are individual people, individual beloved children of God, just like everyone else.
Right. And you can't manipulate them. And this is one of the fundamental reasons for the immorality of cloning from a faith perspective. We'll also talk about from a reason perspective, but just from a faith perspective, God designed human reproduction to work a certain way. And while we can use medical treatments to assist that method, like, giving people infertility treatments and so forth to help increase their natural fertility, we can't just take the process God designed for us and completely replace it with a different process like somatic cell nuclear transfer or deliberately ripping a early human embryo in half or something like that.
Okay. And that's why if someone were to say, well, I don't want to, clone somebody or myself in order to manipulate them or use them, it's just like I want to have a child or something along those lines, that not to use, but just to love. That's still, like, as you just said, that still violates God's design for human reproduction.
It violates God's design. It also, and this is where it blends into the more reason-based, strictly natural law problems with cloning humans. Because let's say you say, well, I just want a child. Well, okay, there are other ways of having children. Some of them are moral, like getting married and producing a child naturally, or adopting a child. There are lots of children who need adoption. Others are not moral, like going out and raping someone, or in vitro fertilization, which also is problematic from a faith perspective because it replaces God's design for how humans are supposed to reproduce. But if you're wanting a clone, there's something more involved because you have other ways of getting a child. You even have other ways of getting a child with genes from you and your spouse. I mean, in vitro fertilization would do that. The church is going to say you shouldn't do it, but that would do it. So why is it you want an identical copy? And this is what gets us into one of the non-religious objections to cloning from a moral perspective. By saying you want an identical copy of yourself, what does that say about you? What does that say about how much you value yourself? And what does it say about what you're doing to the new person? You're imposing your genetic identity fully on somebody else so that this person is going to have to grow up presumably knowing I'm the copy. I'm a copy of this other person. They thought so much of themselves that they made me, and now I'm growing up in their shadow, and to the extent genes affect human destiny, they've imposed their genetic self on me in a fundamental way, leaving no room for any other person's genes. And that there's something deeply creepy and deeply disturbing about wanting to impose yourself on another person and dominate their life genetically that way.
Oh, wow. So that's one of the reason perspective ideas of why cloning is immoral in humans. What are some of the others then?
Well, it's also, certainly at the present stage, it's a dangerous process. We mentioned how it took hundreds of attempts to get Dolly the sheep. Well, it could take hundreds or thousands of attempts to get a successful human clone. And you're creating this massive collection of people who are going to die or be deformed or be exterminated before they're born when they see the experiment is going wrong. Or maybe they get born and then they suffer from some kind of problem medically during their life because the cloning procedure wasn't perfected. So there are dangers involved that, there are reasons why we test drugs and stuff rather than just hauling off and putting them into society. It's because they can have side effects and risks. Also, in the process of cloning, and this is a process that's a problem that's shared with in vitro fertilization, there's a problem of overproduction and then killing the overproduced offspring because in part because you don't know which ones are going to take, scientists, whether in vitro or in making clones, will produce a whole bunch, hundreds or thousands, and then kill most of them. And that's not going to be acceptable either when you're doing it with humans. It may be acceptable when you're doing it with rabbit embryos, but it's not acceptable when you're doing it with unborn human beings. Then there's the fact that in order to produce a human clone, you'd have to invest a huge amount of resources to produce a clone baby. I mean, it would be millions of dollars, if not more, to produce a human being and bring that baby successfully to term. And you have to ask, isn't this a waste just on an economic level? Why spend all this money to produce a genetically identical copy of a person so that you can raise them as a new human being? Shouldn't this money be spent on something better? Helping the poor or other medical research that would benefit more people. Why the obsession with creating a genetically identical baby? Just to feed some millionaire's fantasy life. And then even if you did do that, the clones, as we mentioned, would be living in the shadow of their progenitors, and they could potentially face discrimination. I mean, it would be really weird being around somebody. Now, I myself, if I knew somebody, was a clone of somebody else, I would not hold it against that person because I have a sharp awareness of the fact that children are not responsible for the sins of their parents. So like if someone's born of rape, that is absolutely zero stain on the child. It was the father in the case of a male rapist. And so that's not on the child, but a lot of people probably don't have a sharp awareness of that. And clones growing up in society could easily face discrimination. It's like, you're not one of us. You're one of the strange ones. And so there are additional moral complications on that front.
Now, somebody could be listening to this and they'll say, "Oh, well, it's a lot of talk." But the fact is you've already said, it's really hard to do. It's how likely is it that we're going to see actual human cloning even be possible that this become an issue?
Well, if the reports are right, we've already got it on the embryonic level because they had those ones in 2008 that were allowed to become blastocysts. If you ask me, even though I think human reproductive cloning is immoral, I think it's also probably inevitable. There are no particular technical barriers that would prevent it from happening. In fact, we've already had cloned primates just this year, 2018, a couple of crab-eating macaques. That's a kind of monkey. A couple of monkeys were cloned. And we know human clones are possible because we have identical twins. And even right now, you could, with an in vitro fertilized child, go in and at a certain stage, pull it apart and have a good chance of having identical twins. So there's no, in principle, barrier stopping this. And as is sometimes said in the world of physics, anything that is not impossible is inevitable. And so to quote Jeff Goldblum from Jurassic Park, some scientists are spending so much time thinking about what they could and not enough time thinking about whether they should. So I think human clones, at least on a small scale, are probably inevitable at some point, likely within the next 100 years.
And when that happens, a lot of the stuff we talk about, like in these movies, is probably likely to happen. They'll be used and abused and discriminated against.
Yeah, initially, because of the tremendous cost of producing them, we're likely to see this be a kind of boutique thing for millionaires. It's getting late in life and maybe they want a clone of themselves to carry on their legacy. But if the technology begins to mature, you could then see more of these science fiction scenarios develop. You could, for example, have technology long term tends to make nations capable of things that even lesser developed nations once wouldn't have been able to do. Like, Pakistan is not a particularly developed nation, but it has a nuclear bomb. Right. North Korea, same thing. Well, you could imagine some future version of a state like North Korea saying, let's have a clone army. Let's find a really good soldier and Jango Fett this guy. So that's, something that could happen. You could also see something happening like what was discussed in Aldous Huxley's novel, Brave New World, where you have a stratification of society based on their genetic type, where you have, let's say, a clone worker underclass or something like that, or a clone administrator overclass. Whether these would actually happen or not, one would have to wait and find out. I'm not saying they're all equally likely, but I can imagine a nation saying, let's have some clone warriors.
Interesting. And
yeah,
as well as there have been, things like, what was the show, the movie that it featured, I forget the actors and the name of the movie, but there was a movie where there was this enclave elsewhere of all of these people, very healthy people who would win a chance to go. I think it was called The Island, and they would be sent off to the island. What they really were clones of wealthy people who were being kept as spare parts for wealthy people in case they get sick.
I'm not familiar with one called The Island. That may be a remake. I'm familiar with one called Parts, the Clonus Horror, which had that plot and was later done on Mystery Science Theater 3000. I think more likely than cloning, though, in terms of military applications, would be augmented human beings. I think it's more likely one would have a kind of transhumanist effort to modify existing humans. But clones are not impossible. You could also see life extension, like you mentioned, with spare parts for wealthy people. You could also see attempts to have a kind of human Jurassic Park where we reproduce famous historical figures. Some people have even talked about going to the Shroud of Turin and getting DNA from it and trying to clone Jesus. If you did that, you probably wouldn't end up with Jesus because so many pilgrims have kissed and touched the Shroud of Turin over the centuries that it's got lots of other people's DNA on it. But even if you did, he wouldn't be the Son of God. He would just he would just have similar genes.
Right. Yeah. Well, there's an interesting sci-fi story someone could write.
They've done it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. All right. And sci-fi is fascinated with cloning. There continues to be stuff made. There was a recent Netflix series called Altered Carbon, which included cloning as part of it. So it's likely to be topical for a while. So what's the bottom line here with regards to cloning?
The bottom line is cloning of lesser species is not a problem. Reproductive cloning or cloning any entire human, whether for reproductive or therapeutic purposes, is immoral, but it's likely inevitable.
Okay. All right. That's a sobering thought. And likely to be part of the pro-life movement. I don't want to get into politics, but that probably going to be part of that. So if people want to find out more about this topic, do we have some resources for them?
Yeah, in the show notes, I have a number of links to articles on Wikipedia about cloning in general, human cloning specifically, the ethics of cloning, different Christian views on cloning. I also have a link to an article by the geneticist James Watson from 1971, when people were first starting to talk about cloning humans, where he raises concerns even back then about cloning humans coming from a more secular perspective.
Is this the James Watson who helped discover DNA?
DNA, yes, okay. With Francis Crick.
Okay. All right, great, thank you. And so stick around, folks, because we're come to one of my favorite parts of the show, which is mysterious feedback, where we hear from the audience. And we've got some feedback. This time we're talking about feedback from our show on Watergate. That was episode number 7. And our first feedback comes from M. Sutton Pratt on Facebook, who says there are a lot of theories about what happened at Watergate. I wonder if we'll ever know for certain. What do you think, Jimmy?
It's a fascinating subject, and I think we are likely not to ever get definitive answers. And the reason I say that is because most of the people who were involved have now passed on. And if they were going to reveal what they knew, they would have done so. Even if they didn't want to do it in their own lifetimes, they would have left manuscripts and in the event of my death, I want this published. And we've probably been told the truth by one or a number of them. But so the real truth is probably out there. The question is, how do we identify it from among all the counterclaims? And I don't know that we'll ever be able to do that. So this one may remain a mystery, but if we continue to chip away at it, we may be able to develop a clearer picture.
Interesting. Okay, so and then Richard Lamb on YouTube commented, G. Gordon Liddy used to have a syndicated radio show back in the 90s. He would often label himself as a lapsed Catholic. He tended to lean conservative in his politics.
Right. G. Gordon Liddy, and he was definitely conservative. He was a former FBI man who was one of the people who was involved in the break-in team, and he did have a talk show in the 90s. And I hadn't known he described himself as a lapsed Catholic. I knew he was a lapsed Catholic. I didn't know he said that on the talk show. But according to a book I read by Chuck Colson, who was another one of the Watergate conspirators who later had a religious awakening, I was reading a book by Colson who mentioned that Liddy had at one point come back to his Catholic faith.
Nice.
So that was good.
That's good. And then finally, Jacob, I'm going to pronounce it wrong, sorry. Jacob, either Geese or Geis on YouTube says, dudes, love the extra feedback at the end. That was fun. Great show. I agree with you, Jacob. I love the feedback too.
I do too. We really appreciate it. It adds a nice element to the show to be able to interact with people. So by all means, leave us feedback. We love getting it.
Yes. And so now mystery headlines or mysterious headlines, mystery headlines. Jimmy, what do we have this week for headlines?
So a couple of things, both of them related to astronomy. The first one is the International Astronomical Union may be renaming a law of physics after a Catholic astronomer priest. What we've known up to now as Hubble's law deals with the expansion of the universe. It's named after Edwin Hubble, who in the late 1920s wrote a paper describing, this was like 1929, wrote a paper describing the expansion of the universe. But he was preceded by a couple of years by the Belgian priest, Father George Lemaitre, who is these days credited as the man who basically came up with or initially promoted the idea of the Big Bang. It wasn't called the Big Bang yet, but Lemaitre is credited with that. And because he wrote an earlier paper than Hubble's, even though it was published in French in kind of an obscure Belgian journal, so people didn't notice it as much. The International Astronomical Union is considering renaming the Hubble law as the Hubble-Lemaitre law. So we have a link to an article describing the debate they're having on that right now. So personally, I would be in favor of that, and it would be a lot better than the botched attempt to declassify Pluto as a planet that they also were responsible for and that many of their members are unhappy with.
And in case the name Edwin Hubble sounds familiar, he is the one for whom the Hubble telescope was named.
Yes. Yeah. The other piece is that we have a link to is a story about how astronomers may have found the planet Vulcan.
Live long and prosper, folks.
Yeah, and not the vanished Vulcan planet in our solar system that we're going to do a future episode about, but Mr. Spock's planet Vulcan. The star in the constellation Eridani, or forget the exact suffix you want to put on that in Greek. But the star that has in Star Trek auxiliary literature been identified as the home of the planet Vulcan in Star Trek turns out to have a star, or to have a planet, it seems, that is slightly larger than Earth and within the habitable zone, and would, if it turns out to be a terrestrial planet rather than a mini gas giant, it would have a gravity of about twice that of Earth, and it would also be quite warm. And both of those characteristics fit Mr. Spock's home planet, Vulcan, which is supposed to have a high gravity and be quite warm. Whether the new Vulcan has no moon, we don't yet have the ability to detect.
In a future episode, we're going to have the mystery of what did Gene Roddenberry know and when did he know it?
Yeah. Nice Watergate quote from Senator Howard Baker there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Excellent. Thank you, Jimmy. Those are two great headlines. And so as we come to the end of another episode, I want to remind folks to like, comment, subscribe, make sure you get notifications, and above all, share the episode with everyone that you know, because we're having a blast, and I hope you're having a blast, and more people could enjoy it.
And be sure also go to sqpn.com/give, because we really need your support right now. If you like this show and other ones we produce, we need to hear from you now.
Yes. And so that's it from us. Please send us your feedback on the mystery of cloning, whatever you have to say. In all those various places we mentioned, there are ways to give feedback. You can also send us an audio feedback, and we can play that on the show and interact with you that way. That would be great to hear your voices. So you could go to sqpn.com or to the Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World Facebook page, leave us feedback there, or send an email to mysterious@sqpn.com. You will find links, all the relevant links that we mentioned in this episode, including the headlines, on our show notes on sqpn.com. Until next time, Jimmy Akin, thank you for exploring with us our mysterious world.
Thank you, Dom.
And once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on StarQuest. This is Dom Bettinelli again. We hope you've enjoyed this podcast and that you'll help us keep producing the podcast you love. Thank you for your generosity. To make your pledge and find out about the free thank you gifts we'd like to send you, visit sqpn.com/give. That's sqpn.com/give.